June 6, 1944, 05:12 hours. Normandy coastline, France. The air trembled before the earth did. In the pre-dawn gloom, Wilhelm Cross blinked through the narrow slit of his concrete bunker at Point du Hoc, eyes straining against the shadows offshore. The sea, black and still, betrayed nothing. Then came the first low rumble, soft as thunder, distant as memory. He leaned in. A distant vibration throbbed through the floor like something alive beneath the cement. His breath caught. Then the sky blinked white. The horizon exploded in a sudden bloom of flickering orange flashes, 5, 6, 10, rolling in sequence like the drums of judgment. The sound followed a second later as if the world itself had cracked in two. The entire bunker shifted. Dust poured from the seams. Wilhelm stumbled back, ears ringing, gut clenched. He wasn't the only one. All along the Atlantic wall, men were flung awake by the same question. What in God's name was that? What they didn't know, what none of them could know yet, was that offshore, barely visible through the mist, waited 7 American and British battleships, 12 cruisers, and over 70 destroyers. Each bristled with guns from 5-inch to 16-inch caliber, and every barrel had already zeroed in. This was not harassment fire. This was not a feint. This was annihilation. On the USS Nevada, 10 miles offshore, Seaman First Class Danny Miller stood at gun turret number 1, sweating through his shirt despite the cold. Inside the armored housing, he could barely hear the officer's orders over the massive breathing of the ship, hydraulics hissing, gears winding, steam valves rattling like demons in their chains. All batteries fire for effect. The turret shuddered, then it kicked like a giant's fist. The 16-inch shell, weighing over 2,700 pounds, soared into the sky at 1,700 feet per second. It would reach its arc in under a minute, and when it came down, it would hit with the force of a small earthquake. On shore, Cross barely had time to stand before the shell struck. The bunker didn't crack. It detonated on top of it. A sound like metal screaming erupted, followed by an impossible brightness, and then silence, utter, crushing silence. Across the 5 landing beaches, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword, hundreds of coastal fortifications like this one were being systematically erased. American warships fired with precision corrections from spotter planes and destroyer scouts. They weren't just targeting gun positions. They were pulverizing communications centers, ammunition stores, barracks, and the very cliffs that held them. At Omaha alone, 8 U.S. battleships, including the Arkansas and Texas, were loosing salvos every 40 seconds, each impact sending up geysers of shattered stone, twisted steel, and terrified men. By 06:10 hours, over 2,800 heavy shells had already landed across a 12-mile stretch of French coast. Still, in some sectors, German artillery crews held on. At Long-sur-Mer, a 4-gun battery of 152 naval guns, embedded deep in reinforced bunkers, fought back. The men inside were drenched in sweat and concrete dust. Their commander, Oberleutnant Fischer, screamed over the internal comms for spotting updates. Target bearing, just 5 degrees left. But before the gunners could correct, the USS Arkansas let loose another 16-inch broadside. One shell fell short. The second punched directly through the concrete aperture. The gun emplacement, along with its crew, ceased to exist. A British radar operator aboard HMS Ajax reported simply, "Battery 6C, neutralized." And still the bombardment intensified. By mid-morning, cruisers were closing the distance, some moving within 5,000 yards of the shore, firing their rapid 6-inch and 8-inch batteries at near-flat trajectories to suppress any remaining machine gun nests and snipers hiding among the shattered fortresses. On the bluffs overlooking the beach, young German conscripts, some barely 17, watched their world collapse with a kind of frozen awe. One bunker commander wept openly, not from wounds but from disbelief. "These are not guns," he whispered. "These are earthquakes carried by ships." In the fire control tower of USS Texas, Lieutenant Commander Al McKeever adjusted his headset and gave a clipped nod to the fire direction team. "Zone Charlie 4, firing pattern 5, fire when ready. 5 rounds, battery 2, salvo." The 5 shells landed within 18 meters of their target, a concrete observation post just inland from Veerville. The structure tilted, then fell. A German spotter in the area managed to send a single radio message before his antenna was vaporized. "Amerikanisch Skiff reisen die Erd auf, es ist wie Verdun, nur schlimmer." American ships are tearing the earth apart. It's like Verdun, only worse. At Point du Hoc, the 2nd Ranger Battalion waited in bouncing Higgins boats, watching the hell unfold ahead of them. A corporal muttered, "There's nothing left to climb." But there was. Cracked stone, fire, tangled rebar. And terrified Germans waiting above. Some units held, others broke, and still the guns kept coming. As dawn finally broke in full and the beaches turned to chaos, men storming ashore under machine gun fire, sand turned to red mud, medics screaming for stretchers. The great gray warships sat quietly offshore, blunt-nosed Titans, their barrels glowing faintly with the heat of their wrath. They had done their part, but they weren't done yet. Because miles inland, behind the burning bunkers, behind the minefields and tank traps, lay the real German defense lines. Artillery, mobile reserves, anti-tank emplacements, and fortified crossroads towns that would need more than just men with rifles. They would need fire, more fire. And the ships would oblige. Smoke hung in ribbons over the crumbling cliffs of Point du Hoc, drifting inland with the breeze as if reluctant to leave the carnage behind. The air smelled of chalk, salt, and gunpowder, so thick it made the lungs sting. Every few seconds, the ground trembled, not from German fire, but from American shells detonating somewhere further back, beyond the beaches, deep into the French countryside where German command posts had not expected the war to reach them so soon. At the base of the cliffs, the 2nd Ranger Battalion finally got the signal. "Geo, Geo, Geo." Lieutenant Colonel James Rudder didn't shout. He barked, clipped and hard over the chaos as his men surged forward. Ropes snapped upward, hooked over jagged stone. Rocket-fired grapnels hissed and thumped against the cliffs, pulling taut under their own weight. Some tangled, some fell short, others found purchase. And the Rangers began to climb. They weren't just scaling rock. They were climbing through smoke and falling debris, through pulverized sandbags and splintered bunkers that used to house machine guns. The Germans above were in disarray, some still firing, others dragging comrades from burning pillboxes, others staring down in frozen horror at what had once been an impregnable defense. And then another THOOM rolled across the air like a thunderclap. The USS Nevada had repositioned. Its guns, still hot, now aimed further inland. Spotters had marked a German artillery battery nestled in a small orchard near Grand Camp Maisie, well behind the coastal defenses. A battery that had remained untouched, carefully camouflaged, hidden from aerial recon. But not from the Navy's float planes. A slow, circling Kingfisher observation seaplane had caught the glint of sunlight off a howitzer barrel. One call, one adjustment. The shells came in. Each 16-inch shell dug a crater 30 feet wide, flinging dirt, timber, and bodies into the air like toy pieces. The German battery never fired a shot that day. It simply ceased to exist. And with every strike, German radio traffic grew more erratic. At the German 352nd Infantry Division command post, Major Hartwig Lohmann barked into the field radio, demanding reports. What of the WN-62 bunker line? Silence. What of the Maisie battery? Gone, all guns silent, commander possibly dead. He turned, sweat soaking through his collar despite the cold stone walls around him. His aide, face pale, whispered what none of them wanted to admit. They're not just targeting bunkers, they're targeting command nodes, us. Lohman didn't answer. Because they were right. U.S. Navy bombardment was not random. Thanks to months of aerial photography, French resistance scouting, and a new tactic called time-on-target coordination, the warships offshore were not simply bombarding, they were executing a plan. Shells from multiple ships were arranged to arrive simultaneously at key targets to maximize confusion. Men had no time to take cover. Artillery crews were caught mid-load. Radio relays died before they could send a warning. The Germans didn't even know how many ships were out there. One gunner at Kovel screamed, "There must be hundreds." In reality, it was fewer than 20 warships per beachhead. But that was enough. Because the USS Arkansas alone could fire 2 shells every minute from each of her 6 main guns, each one with a blast radius of 100 yards. Multiply that by every American and British vessel within range, and the effect was an artificial earthquake that simply moved, from beach to bluff, from bluff to battery, from battery to village. And it kept moving. At the small village of Formigny, inland by several kilometers, villagers fled their homes as German troops set up fallback positions. Mortar crews dug shallow pits behind stone walls. MG-34s were mounted in second-floor windows. And yet, somewhere far above the clouds, another Kingfisher circled. Aboard the USS Quincy, a cruiser just 7,000 yards offshore, fire control officers listened to the coordinates being read aloud. Grid square Delta 9, prepare 3-gun salvo. The guns elevated, shells loaded. 3 seconds later, formidable cracks split the comm. By the time the 3rd salvo hit, the town's central square was gone. 2 half-tracks were flipped like toys. A church steeple crumbled. A German lieutenant emerged from a ruined doorway coughing blood and dust, his ears ringing too loud to hear the screams of his men. It wasn't supposed to be like this. They had trained for Allied landings. They had prepared for tanks, for infantry, for air raids, but nothing in their manuals had described this methodical devastation, this unrelenting precision from the sea. And it was only getting worse. Because by noon, reinforcements from the USS Texas had arrived closer to Omaha. She dropped anchor and brought her full broadside to bear, firing at pre-sighted locations, many of them no longer visible beneath the smoke and fire. A small German radio outpost, hidden in a stone barn near Trévieres, managed to catch a final signal from a collapsing strongpoint. No more guns. The cliffs are gone, enemy climbing. They brought the mountain down on us. Silence. Captain Edward Carney aboard the Texas muttered, "That one's done," and calmly nodded to the gunnery officer. "Shift target, the crossroads next." Behind the shore, in the ruined coastal battery headquarters of WN-68, Oberfeldwebel Joseph Marner stood trembling. His hands, once steady with a field map, now shook as dust from another impact drifted from the rafters. He turned to a young private, staring out the shattered gun slit. "Are they still climbing?" The boy didn't answer. He just stepped back, pale and wide-eyed. "They're already here." Seconds later, an explosion, smaller, sharper, echoed through the hallway. Not a naval shell. A grenade. The Rangers had reached the top. Across Normandy, the tide had turned. But not just from the sea. Inland, the Germans had begun to understand something deeper, something more terrifying than the physical destruction. They couldn't see the enemy anymore. The ships were distant shadows behind the fog. The spotter planes were silent dots too small to shoot. The shells landed without warning, from angles never expected. German guns that survived the first hour never got to fire again. Men were buried alive under their own forts, blind to what had hit them. In one coastal town, a captured German officer whispered to his American interrogator, "We fought at Monte Cassino. We fought in Russia, but never this. This is not war. This is God's hand from the ocean." The Americans didn't reply. They didn't need to. Because as the Rangers raised their rifles in the shattered ruins above the beach, as the ships reloaded and adjusted their bearings, and as German officers began burning documents in backrooms inland, one final realization settled in the minds of those who had once manned the Atlantic Wall. The wall was gone. It hadn't cracked. It had been turned to dust. And behind that dust came the Americans, not in scattered boats, but in armadas with steel, fire, and the ocean itself as their artillery. By the late afternoon of June 6, the beaches behind the fire-blackened bluffs were no longer war zones. They were staging grounds, living rivers of men, tanks, trucks, jeeps, bulldozers, and cranes pouring into France like a second, mechanical invasion. The naval guns had done more than silence coastal defenses. They had cleared a runway. Now the real storm was coming ashore. At the small inland town of Isigny-sur-Mer, Oberstleutnant Reinhard Drexler squinted down the road through his field glasses. The Luftwaffe liaison next to him, more a bureaucrat than a soldier, tugged his jacket nervously. "I thought the invasion would bog down on the beach, like Gallipoli, like deep." Drexler didn't answer. He didn't need to. He could already hear it. A sound like rolling thunder, but uneven, lurching, rhythmic. Tanks. Dozens of them. Behind them came the rumble of half-tracks, the clatter of Sherman suspensions, the hiss of canvas-topped trucks braking on dirt roads, each one spewing infantry, ammunition crates, jerry cans, field telephones, wire reels, rations, and radios. And above them all, still distant but constant, came the intermittent crack, thump, crack of naval guns still firing from the sea, targeting not what the Germans could see, but what the Allies knew would matter next. Not machine gun nests. Bridges, rail junctions, artillery parks, reserve columns. A French resistance runner had brought word that German troops from the 915th Grenadier Regiment were mustering east of St. Lo. Their goal, a counterattack against the American beachhead at Utah. The Allies had expected this. The USS Nevada, Arkansas, and the heavy cruiser Tuscaloosa had already ranged them. Spotter aircraft, tiny silhouettes almost invisible to ground gunners, sent coded flashes of mirror light back to their ships. Coordinates received. At 16:47, the order was given. 3 battleships opened fire. They didn't aim at bunkers anymore. They aimed at roads, narrow, winding French arteries where Wehrmacht convoys funneled. The first salvo from the Nevada landed just outside the village of Les Forges. A German supply truck, laden with 88 shells, was driving past a stone wall when the shell landed 25 meters ahead. There was no truck after that. No wall, no village. Only a crater smoking, 17 meters across. An American forward observer, hidden in the hedgerows with a signal radio, marked the impact. He gave one nod to the sergeant beside him. "Just 30 meters east, walk it up the road." And they did. Shell by shell, yard by yard, the naval guns walked their fire inland. Not like artillery used to random, speculative barrages, but with mathematical cruelty. Spotters called out corrections. Crews adjusted elevation, charge, and fuse timing. Some rounds were set to airburst, detonating 30 feet above ground, sending molten steel downward like a vertical shotgun, perfect for eviscerating soft-skinned trucks. Others were delayed fuse, burrowing into the earth before exploding, throwing entire anti-tank emplacements into the air like kicked-over toys. At 17:03, the last functioning 88mm gun defending the St. Lo route was destroyed by a shell from the Arkansas that had traveled 14.6 miles inland, through mist, smoke, and French rain, landing within 18 meters of its target. When the gun vanished, the Germans who saw it didn't run. They just stared. Because they'd never seen a shell that big come from that far, that fast, and that precise. Their sergeant fell to his knees, whispering in disbelief. Der Himmel selbst bombardiert uns. Heaven itself is shelling us. At sea, the gun crews were relentless. Each battleship operated like a floating fortress, but with computers. Yes, computers. Electromechanical fire control analog computers, giant humming boxes of gears, spinning dials and analog memory wheels, process corrections in real time, calculating target movement, ship drift, barrel wear, air pressure, and shell weight variation. The USS Texas had a fire control system so accurate it could correct for Coriolis force, the curvature of the Earth, when firing inland. That's how, at 17:35, the Texas shelled a German command post 23 kilometers inland, in the woods outside Canchi. The post had been deemed unreachable by the Luftwaffe for weeks, hidden by tree cover, camouflaged roof, well away from the front, but not from naval fire. A single shell cracked the canopy and landed squarely in the center of the compound. An entire company of radio operators and staff officers were killed before they knew anyone had found them. Back on land, German morale broke in places no rifle ever reached. In one village, a group of Wehrmacht infantry lay face down in a trench, too afraid to move, as naval rounds bracketed the fields around them. They were part of a reserve unit, never trained for combat, meant to replace losses after the front stabilized. A corporal, blood on his face from a concussive blast, begged his sergeant, "Let's run just anywhere, even backward, just away from the sea." The sergeant, lips trembling, didn't reply. His hands were still over his ears. He couldn't hear anymore. He hadn't heard anything since the last shell hit 90 meters away. As night fell, the battlefield changed. The Americans were ashore in force, infantry, engineers, bulldozers carving new roads into the hedgerows, but the Navy didn't sleep. With radar and infrared scopes, fire coordination continued. Destroyers crept closer to the coast, 2,000 yards, 1,500, 1,000. Their smaller 5-inch guns now tasked with suppressing scattered resistance as Rangers and infantry units advanced building to building. In the shattered hamlet of Vierville, a single MG-42 in a farmhouse attic held up an entire infantry platoon for nearly 20 minutes. The Navy called in a surgical strike. USS Emmons, a destroyer patrolling offshore, fired a single 5-inch shell. It entered through the farmhouse roof. The MG-42 stopped. No one went inside to check. By midnight, the Germans had lost 47 coastal guns, 19 command nodes, 7 counterattack columns, and over 400 supply vehicles, most of it not to infantry, not to tanks, but to naval guns. A Wehrmacht field report, intercepted by Allied intelligence, summarized the day in grim resignation. Enemy seaborne artillery is not indirect fire, it is execution by map. Another message, sent in desperation to OKW headquarters in Berlin, read: "If no Luftwaffe assistance arrives, we cannot hold the coast. The ships are not bombarding, they are razing France itself." But the Luftwaffe couldn't fly. Cloud cover, naval AA screens, and total surprise had grounded most sorties. Only a handful of planes ever reached the beach, and by then, it was too late. The Atlantic Wall, years in the making, was now a smoking memory. Out at sea, Seaman First Class Danny Miller sat on the deck of the Nevada, finally allowed to rest. His arms ached from loading shells. His hearing was still muffled. He looked back toward the distant fires lighting up the horizon, Normandy burning in orange and red. A petty officer passed him a canteen and grinned. "We hit 'em hard." Danny didn't answer at first. He was thinking of what he'd seen through the gunner's scope. Not men, not bunkers. Just shapes, buildings, roads, trees. And how every single one had vanished after a flash of white light. He took a long drink and said, almost to himself, "They thought the cliffs would stop us, the bunkers, the guns, but we brought our own cliffs." June 7, 1944, 06:42 hours. Somewhere between Cairnton and St. Lo. The early morning mist clung to the hedgerows like smoke that had forgotten to rise. German reinforcements, tired, wet, and battered from marching all night, huddled behind hedgerows, haystacks, and broken fences. These were elements of the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division and the 352nd Infantry, thrown into the chaos from inland to plug the holes forming all across the collapsing Atlantic Wall. They hadn't even reached the front yet. They never would. A captain in the lead half-track raised his binoculars, just in time to see the tree line ahead vanish in a blossom of fire and earth. Naval gunfire. Again. There were no spotter planes this time. No visible markers. Just a whine in the air like a falling star, then a shattering explosion so loud it rattled their teeth inside their skulls. What the hell was that? One soldier screamed, fumbling with his rifle. The captain didn't answer. Because what followed wasn't another explosion. It was dozens. A full salvo. 10 miles away, the USS Texas had fired a coordinated spread of 14-inch shells at a crossroads near Montmartin-en-Grenez. Intelligence from French resistance, radio intercepts had pinpointed this narrow stretch of road as the primary German fallback artery between Caen and Cairnton. The Allies wanted it closed, and the Navy would oblige. From the deck of the Texas, Lieutenant Commander Al McKeever checked the plotting table. A junior officer leaned in with a message from the spotter team ashore. "Sir, infantry reports enemy armor assembling in the orchard southeast of St. Clement." McKeever didn't hesitate. "Battery 1 through 4, prepare for rapid fire." The naval guns thundered in sequence. Each 14-inch shell flew at 2,500 feet per second, covered nearly 12 miles in under a minute, and landed with the force of a bunker-buster bomb. In the orchard, 5 German Panzer IVs were concealed beneath camouflage nets. Not one fired a round. The first shell landed between the lead 2 tanks, flipping them into each other like metal toys. The second struck the base of a tree, and the entire root system exploded outward, sending flaming branches into fuel drums. The orchard burned. A British signal operator, watching from a church steeple a mile away, reported, "Target reduced to cinders, no movement, immediate area charred, no armor survives." German soldiers who survived the blasts no longer tried to return fire. Some fired in panic, emptying rifles into trees, into the sky, into shadows. Others ran. Many dropped to the ground and screamed not from injury, but from sheer mental collapse. A medic with the 915th Grenadier Regiment recorded in his field notebook, "They fear the sound before the blast, the whistle, the crackle, the pause before the world ends. This is not fear of men. This is fear of being unseen and erased." Not far away, the town of St. Lo braced for battle. Local civilians, those who had not yet fled, cowered in basements as German officers commandeered buildings for headquarters, turned schoolhouses into supply depots, and filled church courtyards with ammunition crates and fuel drums. It was a mistake. Naval intelligence had decrypted a German high-frequency burst sent from that exact position. By 14:00, a Kingfisher observation plane from the USS Quincy confirmed the coordinates. Within minutes, Quincy's 8-inch guns opened fire from nearly 18 miles out. The first 2 shells landed on the town's edge. The third struck the schoolhouse directly. The explosion could be seen from 5 towns over. The schoolhouse vanished. German soldiers were thrown from second-floor windows like broken mannequins. Shrapnel tore through stone and bone alike. Fuel drums ignited. The ammunition store cooked off seconds later, tearing a crater in the ground that would remain for months. The radio operator on the Quincy simply logged. Target neutralized. No return signal, continuing barrage. German command in Caen grew increasingly frantic. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt demanded to know why reserves weren't reaching the front, why the 21st Panzer Division wasn't already counterattacking the beachheads, why the roads were dead. But the radios brought only static. Because the radios were in craters. So were the operators. Every hour that passed, the Americans pushed inland another mile, another hedgerow, another farmhouse. Behind them, the Navy shifted its fire grid like a moving wall of thunder, ensuring that every kilometer taken stayed taken. By June 8, the Germans tried a different tactic. A night march. Columns of supply trucks, horse-drawn wagons, and motorcycles rolled quietly under moonlight toward the front. Headlights off, orders whispered, camouflage draped over cargo. The men didn't talk, they'd heard stories. Some didn't believe them. They would soon. Just before dawn, high overhead, an American B-17 reconnaissance variant circled above the dark countryside. It wasn't bombing. It was flashing signals back to the destroyers offshore. And waiting. At 04:12, with the convoy crawling through the village of Oval-sur-Levée, USS Emmons, USS Carmack, and USS Baldwin all opened fire. Not blindly, not in panic. They fired pre-registered strikes, already plotted based on earlier intel. The entire convoy was bracketed. Shells rained from the sky with no muzzle flash in sight, no sound of aircraft, no hint of an enemy. Just impact after impact, lighting up the village in bursts of hellish orange and red. A French farmer hiding in a root cellar with his children said later. It was as if God had found the map and pressed his thumb down. When American paratroopers passed through the village 2 days later, they counted no surviving vehicles and fewer than a dozen dazed German prisoners wandering the ruins. At sea, the tone had shifted. There was no celebration on the decks, no cheering. Just precision. Routine. Discipline. Each fire order was followed by a breathless silence, each impact confirmed by a dull radio voice. Some gun crews barely looked up anymore. The targets weren't bunkers now. They were ghosts of villages, fleeing armies, things that moved but could not hide. And still the Germans tried to hold. At Hill 192, a key high ground southeast of Bayeux, the Germans had dug in deeply. Mortar crews, dugouts, overlapping MG-42s and artillery teams. They thought the Americans would have to bleed to take it. They were half right. But the bleeding started on the German side. Because the Navy had prepared something special. Not high-explosive shells. Armor-piercing rounds. Designed to pierce the steel hulls of battleships, these monsters could burrow through 10 feet of reinforced concrete before detonating. The USS Nevada fired 6 of them into Hill 192's ridgeline. Each one disappeared into the earth and then erupted beneath German positions like underground volcanoes. Entire dugouts imploded. Machine gun nests collapsed. German mortars were flung into the air, spinning like they'd been ejected from the earth. One American soldier, watching from the low ground, murmured, "The mountain's on our side now." By the third day, many German officers had stopped believing in the Atlantic Wall, or in Hitler's maps, or in the idea of victory at all. They now believed in two things: that the enemy had endless men and machines, that those machines had guns the size of trains and reached longer than the horizon. In the ruins of a command post outside Treviers, a German major scrawled one final message into his field journal before burning it. "They do not advance like men. They advance like a storm. We shoot at the front and are struck from the rear. The war now has a direction. It comes from the sea."